Everybody's good? No questions over the nervous system, how that's going to adapt, how motor learning occurs, how we're going to go and myelinate along with increased diameter so that we're going to be able to do a better job of sending signals to areas. We're going to be inhibiting our GTOs and activating our muscle spindles to a higher degree, how we're interfacing all this information. And with time, we're actually getting better at not just contracting our muscles, but relaxing them more rapidly. But otherwise, everybody's good to go. Then we can go ahead and we'll move on forward and start chatting about the joys of the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is effectively all of the different hormones in your body that are going to be regulating everything that's going on. Now, these hormones are always going to be specific to certain receptors. So it's not just the hormones you produce, but it's the amount of receptors you have for said hormones that are going to give them their effects. And then if you have those receptors, then they're going to have those actions. So the key is, does the actual cell have a receptor for the hormone so it's even going to do anything? So we're going to talk about briefly the different glands, how they're going to go ahead and work, and then how we're going to be modifying our hormones both during training and then after training in order to optimize performance and then also getting into recovery. So the endocrine system is chemical signaling throughout the body. It's much slower acting, but longer acting than our nervous system. Now, this is all about maintaining our homeostasis. So that way, we're going to have all of our cells as active as they need to be and no more active than necessary. So we're going to go ahead and get that signaling to essentially go throughout the body according to what we need at that moment. And we're going to use good old negative feedback to keep ourselves where we need to be within certain levels. Now, once again, remember, we're interested not just in the hormone amount, but then actually how much of that hormone is free, and then how many receptors we have to bind to. So the major organization of this is going to be coming through that hypothalamus that we talked about, obviously just a little bit ago on the nervous system, and then our pituitary gland, which is going to be the master gland. Now, this in turn is going to influence the functioning of our thyroid gland, our parathyroid gland, our thymus, our adrenals, our kidneys, our pancreas, and our gonads. So whichever you happen to have, that's what it's going to be effectively influencing. And then in turn, this obviously is going to change between being at rest and during exercise. We're going to have different hormones being released at different levels. Some of this obviously doesn't need to be interfaced through the pituitary. Others are going to be controlled via different mechanisms. But once again, effectively is coming back to really versions of negative feedback. So now we have three major classes of hormones. Now the first major class is going to be what's known as steroid hormones. These are going to be hormones that all come from the major molecule cholesterol. Now these are going to be made of essentially a fatty type of molecule, and that means they're going to be able to go through our membrane. So from there, it's going to go into the membrane and bind to the secondary messenger, which in turn typically is going to literally activate DNA translation and then transcription. Now, what we're going to find is we have a number of different glands that have different types of steroid hormones. Now, obviously, when we say steroids, people immediately think of testosterone, which is a steroid hormone, but that also involves estrogen and progesterone. Along with, we have cortisol, our major stress hormone, and aldosterone, which is a major hormone in regulating our fluid levels. Now, we then have our non-steroid hormones, and that comes into two subgroups, where we have our peptides. So these are really, really big proteins, and they bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell, which in turn is going to activate a signaling pathway inside of the cytosol of the cell, and obviously can influence our DNA expression. Now, when we talk about the big protein peptide hormones, we're talking about insulin. We are talking about growth hormone and insulin like growth factor 1. Whereas we then have our amino acid derived hormones. So these are literally just very tiny single amino acids with some modifications hormones. And that's going to be our thyroid hormones, T3, T4, triiodine, which is going to come from a precursor of, it's not tyrosine. It's, oh, maybe threonine, but I'm probably wrong there. And then our adrenal hormones, which is going to be epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is more of a neurotransmitter, and those are going to be derived from tyrosine. Now, hormones are going to be secreted effectively in bursts. So we're going to have a solid amount released, and then it's going to come back down, then it's going to be released and come back down. Now, different hormones obviously are going to be at higher levels at different points of the day, depending on what we're talking about, and during different parts of the cycle, specifically for the ladies out there, when it comes to estrogen and progesterone. Now, these are normal, and this is going to be part of that, once again, signaling via negative feedback throughout the body, so that when we have too much of a hormone, we're going to effectively lower our secretion, and when we have too little of a hormone, we're going to increase our secretion. And the basic idea there is obviously to keep ourselves within certain ranges at the same time. You can have certain aberrations, obviously, with a lot of different hormones, or issues with production in the first place. And remember, it's not just how much hormone you have, it's do you have enough receptors for said hormones. So looking at how much we really have in the blood is not always a good indicator, because like anything else, insulin resistance is a great example here, because as we are producing more and more insulin because of a lack of insulin receptors on our cells, it's going to look like your production is fine, but in reality, it's the other side where we're having a lack of sensitivity to the hormone. Now, this is going to occur via what's known as downregulation. So that means we have less receptors on the cell surface, and upregulations where we're going to have more receptors on the surface. And in fact, that's why we do exercise in general, because that tends to increase, upregulate the amount of insulin receptors we have, which in turn allows for better management of blood glucose, which decreases the risk of things like type 2 diabetes. Now, remember, these hormone receptors are going to be specific to certain hormones. So if we don't have a receptor for said hormone, it's not going to have an effect. In fact, this does occur. Have any of you guys, are any of you guys familiar with individuals that effectively, how to say, there was a South African female sprinter years ago who was stripped of her medals because it turns out, based upon blood tests and actually looking at chromosomes, that she is in fact male, though anatomically female. Are you guys familiar with that? Okay. Now, yeah, it's incredibly rare. We're talking about like less than 1 in 10,000. But on a planet with over 7 billion humans, you got a lot of these people walking around. And they do not realize that they are in fact male, because anatomically, like if you saw them with, all their clothes off, they actually have female genitalia. They just don't have a uterus, so there's no cervix. And so what you're going to find with these anatomically female, but like physiologically male individuals, they're going to have well, statistically speaking, they've got a higher likelihood of being found in sports and then one other endeavor. And who wants to guess where you're more likely to find people like that? And while you guys are guessing, the reason this occurs is because of a lack of androgen receptors on the gonad. So the default gender of the human body is female. So if you produce enough testosterone, obviously during development, your Wolffian ducts mature, and then your Mullerian ducts essentially atrophy. And so what happens is there's not enough testosterone, there's no receptor for it. So the Wolffian ducts and otherwise don't mature. So they have testicles, they just sit where obviously the ovaries do, and they don't ever actually develop, penis and other parts of genitalia there. But anatomically, like I said, that person's female. Well, no, these people are anatomically female, but they have obviously male genetics. And so no, this only happens to females. But the most likely other location to find them is in supermodels and people that do modeling, because they typically are leaner, taller and with a narrower bone structure, which gives them an advantage in things like modeling when it comes to being female. So statistically speaking, there's a solid shot that one of those Victoria's Secret models is actually genetically a guy. But at the same time, who cares? Gender is a construct. So, but it's an important story to understand where, once again, if you don't have receptors, the hormone doesn't have an effect. And you do have receptors for different hormones in a variety of different types of tissue. So if we could select only the receptors on certain types of tissue, you would have a certain advantage, or not so much advantage, but you could get things done you wanted to without negative consequences. So how many of you guys are familiar with what is known as SARMs, selective androgen receptor mediators? So anyone want to try to give the basics of what that is to the class? You can unmute yourself or type it out, whatever you prefer. Nope. No, no worries. What selective androgen receptor mediators are, or SARMs, like what they do. And also, guys, here is that athlete I was telling you guys about. So what a selective androgen receptor mediator is it's a central like analog of testosterone, or at least it fits in the receptor. And the idea is it only fits in the testosterone receptors that you want them to. So, okay, let's talk, and we're obviously going to use this testosterone. What are the tissues that have a actual receptor for testosterone? Okay. So obviously there's some testosterone receptors a little bit on the, obviously the gonads, but the genitals and otherwise, but where else? Where else might we see testosterone receptors in the human body? I wonder. Muscle tissues being one of them, absolutely. What else? What else, guys? Not really so much on the thyroid gland there, Colleen. Yeah, your nervous system is actually slightly influenced by testosterone. What else? So not really affecting your heart rate. The key is what tissues have an actual androgen receptor on it. Muscle, tendon, bone, facial hair, chest hair, if you happen to have an androgen receptor for it. So, like my sister and I, if she had the same testosterone levels as I do, she would have the same facial hair that I have, simply due to the effects of testosterone. So you have to have, remember, guys, primary and secondary sex characteristics. So all those things that all of a sudden showed up whenever you hit puberty, armpit hair, pubic hair, etc. All of those, that's due to, once again, your own hormonal productions. So keep in mind, a SARM, the idea is it's only going to bind to the actual muscle, the bone, and the tendon androgen receptors. It's not going to bind to the secondary sex characteristics. In theory, you wouldn't have the deepening of the voice, facial hair, changing of the bone structure of the face. And because of this, you could take SARMs and not have the side effects that come with taking testosterone if you're female, much less taking super physiological doses if you happen to be male. Now, what's the major advantage of giving someone SARMs when we're not talking about athletics? Would be the advantage of just only affecting muscle, tendon, and bone tissue from using a selective androgen receptor mediator if it worked that well? Yeah, can obviously help people recover from injuries. What else? Yep, help gain muscle, help improve bone mineral density, help improve tendon strength. What population could really have a lot of positive effects on their health by, thank you, Evan, increasing strength and in turn improving performance of daily tasks? You could give this to your grandparents and specifically your grandma, and grandma all of a sudden wouldn't look like grandpa. Instead, she would just have an increase in her muscle mass, increase in bone mass, and increase in her tendon strength, decreasing risk for things like osteoporosis, decreasing risk of injury, and improving their overall quality of life. Now, that hasn't been what's panned out yet. This is still something that's obviously under research and development. And obviously, at some point, that it can actually work well, then that would be great, because now you're going to increase the quality and potentially the quantity of some people's lives, because they're going to literally be able to have essentially better physical performance. So it's important to understand, guys, it's not just the amount of hormone, but it's the amount of receptors for that hormone. Does that make sense to you guys? Awesome. Oh, sorry. No, no kidding. It's still very much so in its infancy, and that's the problem. Is the SARMs that are on the market are ones that are still being researched, or big pharmaceutical companies are no longer researching those drugs because they had too many side effects or too many issues with them, so it wasn't worth trying to actually make them be true pharmaceutical agents. So I am at this point not going to encourage anyone really to play around with SARMs. Now, prostaglandins, and this can be variations of arachidonic acid, and that's a fatty acid, effectively are going to be important for like localized inflammation. Otherwise, this can be like interleukin 6 and otherwise that you're going to release thanks to hard training and otherwise. Now, once we're really starting to get moving, we're going to see changes in our anterior pituitary, so the front side of the pituitary, our thyroid gland, our adrenals at the top of our kidneys, and then our pancreas. Now, these in turn are going to help with modifications of carbohydrate and fat metabolism during exercise. And remember, protein is not going to be a major constituent. So the pituitary gland itself is literally attached to the hypothalamus, specifically the anterior pituitary to the inferior part of the hypothalamus. Now there's the anterior, intermediate, and posterior, and each of those are going to actually release different types of hormones. Now, exercise is going to increase the secretion of everything that is in turn released from the anterior pituitary, and that's going to be growth hormone, which is obviously a very potent hormone when it comes to building tissues, anabolic. The only tissue that actually decreases in size and function due to growth hormone production is going to be fat tissue. Now, this is also going to help with building muscle, and this is also going to help with the stimulation of the metabolization of fat in the body. Now, the higher the intensity of our exercise, so meaning doing things like sprinting, maximal lifting, the greater the amount of growth hormone that's going to be released. The lower the intensity, the lower amount of growth hormone that will be released. Now, the thyroid itself is going to be stimulated by the pituitary gland, but also that triiodothyronine and thyroxine, so yeah, thyronine is going to be the amino acid it comes from, is going to literally increase the metabolic rate of our tissues. Now, this is also helping with protein synthesis, increasing the number and the size of our mitochondria, so hence the powerhouses for aerobic metabolism in our cell, along with getting us to use more glucose and the rate at which we're going to be turning over glucose and freeing up fat. Too high of thyroid levels, and you're talking about individuals that are going to have a really hard time putting on weight. They're probably feeling very stressed all the time. They're having a hard time effectively eating enough. And then people that are hypo are going to naturally have a very low metabolic rate from what one would expect, and they're not going to be anywhere near as energetic. They're going to have lower turnover of these tissues, and both high and low thyroid levels can lead to cardiovascular issues. So the thyroid stimulating hormone released from the anterior pituitary in turn is going to release our T4. Now, T4 is effectively in the non-active form of thyroid hormone, which in turn is going to then convert over into T3, which is going to be the active form. And it's not even the total amount of T3 hormone, it's free T3, because T3 will also be bound up to things like albumin. Now, obviously, the longer we're going to go ahead and do exercise, we can actually start to see a suppression in our T3. Now, this is like going out there and going hard for 3, 4, 5 hours, but that's going to cause a decline in resting metabolic rate, which in turn can make it harder for individuals to lose weight. And that's why doing, massive amounts of exercise as a means of weight control, and I'm referring to massive amount, can have some issues with effectively inhibiting thyroid function. Now, the adrenal medulla, so that's the center of the adrenal gland, that's where we're going to be releasing our sympathetic nervous system hormones, our epinephrine and our norepinephrine. This in turn is going to increase our heart rate, the force our muscles can contract, and our blood pressure, because we're getting global vasoconstriction. Now, the local factors that are going to cause vasodilation to the muscles we're using when exercise are going to override that, which is great because it means we do a better job of sending blood where it matters as long as we're exercising when we're having a stress response. If you're not exercising and you're having a stress response, that's a bad thing because now we're negatively affecting these tissues without having those controls. Now, epinephrine is also going to help you break down glycogen at a faster rate and also free up free fatty acids. This is useful because it's allowing us to use fuels more efficiently. However, when you're doing it for things like long distance aerobic training, if you dump too much epinephrine, the problem is going to be is you're going to chew through your carbohydrates way faster than you wanted. And because of that, turns out you're going to have lower performance. Now, the cortex on the outside is where we're going to get what's known as our corticosteroids. Now, this is going to be glucocorticoids, aka cortisol, which is going to be that major stress hormone, which is going to help us effectively make new glucose and free up fatty acids and even break down proteins to use as energy. Cortisol is a double-edged sword. It frees up a lot of things to use for energy, but it also is going to help us break down things. So if we're constantly flooding ourselves with cortisol, it's really, really hard to gain appreciable lean mass because it turns out that's working in opposition. It is also anti-inflammatory, which is great. It helps you not feel so banged up. It's also inhibiting your immune system. So too much cortisol and your immune system doesn't work as well. And congratulations, you now get sick. And saying this, hopefully in some of you guys, it's kind of turning the gears in your head a little bit, in that you've maybe realized that like when you're really stressed out from work, school, life, and everything in general, you're more likely to catch a cold or get sick because it turns out stress is cumulative and cortisol is going to be one of those major hormones that is going to be released whether or not you're having to psych yourself up to lift a heavy weight, you're doing long, hard training, or you just have to deal with a boss that's a jerk or something else along those lines that's constantly causing you to pump cortisol into your veins. Now, the pancreas is going to be the major organ in charge of managing your blood sugar. It's going to release insulin so that we're going to bring our glucose down when the level's too high, and it's going to release glucagon to bring the levels up when it goes too low. Now, insulin is usually being released in response to a meal that specifically has carbohydrates and protein, whereas glucagon itself is going to be released because of the low glucose levels, which is going to help free it up from the liver, breaking down that liver glycogen and then sending it through the bloodstream, along with getting the liver to produce more glucose and once again, dropping that in the bloodstream. So we would really, really prefer to have glucose available all the time when we're exercising. You can get by on ketone bodies and ketosis, but it's not fun. It's going to be miserable. Some of you guys have you guys done a long enough run, specifically the cross-country kids here, to where you hit the wall? So, Colleen, what did that feel like? If you want to unmute yourself and kind of explain that.
So basically it feels like you like can't run anymore, but you know, like you just feel like really tired all of a sudden. It just kind of hits you. I don't know.
Yeah, it
It's
feels
hard
like
to
you're running in sand all of a sudden.
Yeah, it gets like way harder to run than it was.
Start to feel a little loopy and kind of not fully with it too.
Yeah, your head will start to like hurt a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. So it turns out your nervous system also really enjoys carbohydrate as a fuel source. So when you're bonking, now we've got to use beta oxidation, which is a fine energy source. However, it can only really generate ATP at about 2/3 of the speed that we're getting it from aerobic glycolysis. And because of this, turns out you're going to be going a lot slower. And so we want to really preserve as much carb as we can. So hence why we're going to break down and use the glycerol from triglycerides to make some glucose, as we can also break down proteins and break them into glucose also. So that's something you will do if you effectively don't have enough carbs, and it is miserable. So in order to keep that blood sugar relatively consistent, glycogen is going to be broken down into glucose inside of your liver, and then that glucose is going to be put into your bloodstream. Now that's obviously going to be taken up by those exercising muscles, and specifically, we're going to see that glucagon is going to help do this, as will epinephrine and norepinephrine, and then obviously, to a lesser extent, cortisol is going to help regulate this blood glucose level. Now, what we're going to find is that growth hormone actually is going to work in opposition, and that is going to free up those fatty acids, but it's not going to actually improve our glucose uptake. And we're going to find that just higher T3, T4 is going to increase the amount of glucose we're breaking down and breaking down fat. Now, how much obviously we're releasing is always going to be very contingent upon how intense the exercise we're doing is and how long of a duration. So if you guys were to try to go running with Colleen or Abby, you guys would at some point hit the wall, and you probably hit it before them just because they're more adapted to it. They're probably store more glycogen, and they're able to use more fat metabolism at a higher intensity. Now, even if you guys just went for a super long hike, you try to go out there hiking for 5, 6, maybe 8, 9 hours, at some point you'd run out of glycogen, you'd bonk, you'd have a hard time. So it's like anything else. This is something that will occur at some point. It just takes a solid amount of time for this to occur for most people. Now, as our exercise intensity goes up, we're going to be releasing more and more epinephrine and norepinephrine. Once again, we're going to be breaking down that glycogen even faster in both our liver and our muscles, and we're going to really deplete the muscle glycogen before the liver glycogen. Liver glycogen is obviously general. It goes in your bloodstream, can go anywhere. The muscle glycogen is referring to the actual muscles you're using for those exercises. So if you're just riding on a bike, you're not really burning through the glycogen in your lats. However, the ones in your quads, that's getting chewed through really quickly. So as we go further and further, now we're getting into that liver glycogen. The muscles are going to take up even more glucose from the blood if they can, and we're going to see that our glycogen levels are going to keep plummeting. So you're going to see this wonderful relationship. If notice the glucose level, this is percent change from baseline, pretty much stays about the same for the entire time of 3 hours of exercising. Cortisol is going to reach its peak after about half an hour, and then it's going to slowly come back down close to baseline levels after about 3 hours. But we can see how that glucagon comes up and it stays up, and then we see that norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to both be increasing, albeit at a slower rate, as you've gone further and further into long essential aerobic work. Now, freeing up the glucose is only half of it. The other is the insulin itself is what's going to help put it into the cells. So obviously when we're exercising, we don't really have a lot of insulin going around, but we do have better insulin sensitivity. So even though we don't have as much insulin, we're more sensitive to it, and we're going to do a better job of taking that glucose into our cells. So this is why we usually are going to advocate pretty heavily for exercise when people have type 2 diabetes, because that exercise itself is in turn going to increase their cellular sensitivity to insulin, and because of that, they're obviously going to pick it up with much greater ease. Now, when it comes to fat metabolism during exercise, it turns out we're going to be using it pretty much the entire time, but at pretty low amounts, especially as our intensity of exercise keeps going up and up. Now, this is going to be broken down through growth hormone and epinephrine being the two major hormones that are doing it, along with cortisol. Now, when we say triglyceride, what we're referring to is 3 individual free fatty acids and that are all bound to one glycerol. So once we hormonally break this down from triglyceride and those 3 fatty acids, those will go in the bloodstream, go to the cells, be broken up beta oxidation. The glycerol itself can actually be used as a component with another glycerol to undergo gluconeogenesis and literally enzymatically be brought back into the form of glucose and then shipped out of the liver again to be utilized for energy. So if we want to break down more fat, not only do we need less insulin, but we need more of our stress hormones, cortisol, and growth hormone. Now, this is going to occur by what's usually referred to as hormone sensitive lipase. And so this in turn is going to be what's kicking it off and enzymatically allowing this to happen. And like anything else, it's the joys of negative feedback, which is going to give us only what we need to get through exactly what we're doing at that time. Now, the next component we're going to get into is the joys of fluid regulation during exercise and how that in turn is going to influence performance, influence our ability to maintain outputs. Now, as you're sweating out from your pores, you're pulling plasma volume. So that's the water component of your blood effectively. And this in turn is going to be increasing our osmotic pressures and otherwise. And we're going to go ahead and now be causing our blood to become more concentrated. Since our blood's more concentrated, it's harder for the heart to pump it beat by beat. Along with, we're going to see that our blood pressure is going to be potentially going down thanks to effectively trying to relax a little bit depending on what's going on. Now, our hormones are there to affect this. Now, starting off with our posterior pituitary, so that's the backside of the pituitary, along with our adrenal cortex and our kidneys are going to be important here. So specifically, our posterior pituitary is going to release what's known as antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin, which is actually the major bonding hormone that you're going to release whenever you're in a relationship or effectively around a child. So that way you get no Stockholm syndrome to take care of them, no matter how much of a monster they might be and how little they let you sleep. Now, this in turn is going to be secreted not because of hormonal stimulation from the hypothalamus, but instead this is going to be direct neurosignals from the hypothalamus. And the antidiuretic hormone is specific to exercise. And that is going to tell our kidneys to hold on to more water. So we're not going to be urinating that much. We're not going to be effectively removing a lot of fluid and going through, obviously, the typical volumes we'd have of urine, given we wouldn't be exercising. So what's going to stimulate this antidiuretic hormone release? Well, it turns out a lower plasma volume, and now we're going to have more increased, essentially, thickness of our blood, hematocrit, because we've got less fluid there. And this increased osmolarity is going to, in turn, tell us to hold on to fluid, specifically water, at a much higher rate. Now, this is good because it's going to help us avoid water loss and decrease the risk of dehydration, but it's not a complete catch-all in that you can still obviously risk dehydration over a long enough period of time because the body's going to still be sweating due to exercise. The key is you're not having the extra loss due to the exercise that you're doing. And I know this part is pretty difficult to read. It's one of the figures, obviously, from your text. Do yourself a favor, make sure that you can go ahead and read this because this antidiuretic hormone is going to literally influence the functioning of your kidneys. And this is going to also lead itself into the production of other things, our mineralocorticoids, aka aldosterone, which is telling us to hold on to sodium. And obviously sodium being the major component of electrolytes along with potassium for our electrochemical gradients on our nervous cells and our muscle cells. Now, what's fascinating is the body has a hormonal way to hold on to sodium so we don't lose too much of it. It doesn't have a way to get rid of excess sodium. And that's why you see low sodium diets, because it turns out, that's something that, especially if you're not sweating regularly, you can obviously, in certain contexts and individuals, have too much and have yourself some issues. There isn't actually really the same type of situation with potassium because before really the Western diet, it would be natural that people would take in a whole lot of potassium every single day through just the normal food that they would have eaten between plant vegetation and, essentially those really fruits and vegetables in general are going to have pretty high yields of potassium. So we've got a little less than 10 minutes left. Are you guys adequately bored of all the things that I've been teaching you guys so far today? Okay, well, I appreciate that, Noah. Now, here's what we're gonna go ahead and have you guys do. Got 17 of you. So in your group, okay, define what tissues your hormone affects, okay? How this can influence recovery. Actually, we'll just go with that. We'll keep it simple since we are obviously limited on the number of people that we have today. So group 1 is going to have growth hormone. Group 2 is going to have insulin-like growth factor 1. Group 3 is going to have estrogen. And group 4 is going to go ahead and have testosterone. Okay? It is a lot of information. So I'm going to put this up in the chat so you guys can see it. It's 2:07. Plan on coming back at like 2:13. And you guys are going to go ahead and just paste in what you came up with, and then we'll talk about it briefly, and then you guys will be done for the day. So have fun and go ahead and just do your best. Some of the stuff is a little bit more difficult to fully understand as far as how it can influence recovery. Excuse me. But go about it best you can, guys. Have fun. So, yeah, good work on the testosterone. Where are my other groups at? Absolutely. So insulin-like growth factor is a big component when it comes to muscle performance. Good. Now, Colleen, another big component of estrogen that a lot of people overlooked is it actually is important when it comes to insulin sensitivity, and not to mention cardiovascular health. It's very important for both of those. Yeah, and absolutely, growth hormone affects every single tissue in the body, except for, well, it really just causes your fat to shrink, but growth hormone can, even when abused, it can improve visual acuity. Literally your vision can get better, but it also can cause hypertrophying of your intestines, which is a bad thing, but we'll get to that later on in class. But absolutely, growth hormone can definitely help increase performance. So good work today, guys. We're going to go ahead and talk more about this, obviously, when we meet on Monday. Remember, for our class on Friday, it's the wonderful Wingate Lab, so make sure you go and try to do that at one of the treadmills of the rec. And if you guys really want to do it on absolute brute force pain mode, get on the Schwinn Airdyne and have a friend record the what's on the screen and just sprint as hard as you can on that thing for 30 seconds, because it will give you a wattage. And it should actually do the same thing on the bikes, but the bikes, you want to put that resistance pretty much nearly all the way at max, and 30 seconds all out, or just run on that treadmill as far as you can. So Schwinn Airdyne or bike, 30-second max speed. You could even do it on a rower, and you want to get your wattage effectively the average of every 5 seconds. Or it's that treadmill at 8 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour if you're male or female, 20% grade, as long as you can hold on. So stay safe out there, guys, and have a great one. Yes, there should be the conversions on the sheet of how you actually are going to convert that data on, or convert that data to what you do need, Abby. So go ahead and just do those conversions that happen to be on the sheet, and just follow that, and it'll give you the information for your power output. So stay safe out there, guys. Have a great day.